Epilogue. The universe lets them rest. The fire crackled softly. The scent of tea and something warm simmering in the kitchen filled the air. Clint's low muttering could be heard as he argued with Strange about proper seasoning. The world was moving on, but here in this moment, Loki and the Ranger had nothing to do but exist. Together, and for now, for just this night, that was enough. A quiet dinner, a fragile peace. The cabin was filled with the gentle crackling of the fire, the soft clink of dishes, the low murmur of conversation. The world outside was dark, still, silent, but inside there was warmth. Inside there was something fragile, something whole, something waited to be mended. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Loki, the Ranger, Strange, and Clint sat together at the same table. The unexpected feast. Clint had outdone himself. Despite the limited resources, despite the fact that he had to improvise half the ingredients, the meal before them was surprisingly delicious. Rich, warming stew, the kind that stuck to your ribs and chased away the cold. Freshly baked bread, crisp and golden from whatever magic Strange had subtly used when no one was looking. Even the tea was flawlessly brewed. Loki raised an eyebrow, glancing at Clint as he took a slow sip from his cup. I never would have suspected that you had culinary talent, Spartan. Clint smirked, breaking off a piece of the bread. I have many talents. You just don't appreciate most of them. Loki huffed a quiet chuckle, but for once he did not argue. The Ranger sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort, their fingers occasionally brushing as they ate. There were no grand words, no urgent conversations, just this simple, quiet, human moment. Until Loki broke the silence, until he asked the question. What happened? Loki's voice was soft but certain. After I erased him, after everything faded. The question hung in the air like smoke. Strange set his spoon down. His gaze was unreadable but not unkind. You disappeared. Loki frowned. I know that much. No, Strange corrected. You didn't just disappear. You ceased. You were erased. Not physically, not dead. But there was no trace of you. Just an emptiness where something should have been. Loki's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Strange continued. And he gestured toward the Ranger, his voice lowering slightly. She was the only one who remembered you, the only one left carrying your absence, and it nearly destroyed her. Loki's breath hitched. His gaze shifted to the Ranger beside him, taking her in as if seeing her for the first time all over again. The shadows under her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture, the weight she still carried even now. His chest tightened. The thought of her being alone in that kind of pain, it was unbearable. The Archer's Role. That's where I came in, Clint said, rolling his shoulder. Strange figured she could need someone who knew how to pull people back up from the brink. Someone stubborn enough to not let her disappear into herself. Loki narrowed his gaze, scanning Clint with something unreadable. And that was you. Clint huffed, taking a sip of tea. I've been there before, and I wasn't about to let her go through it alone. The Ranger said nothing, but her fingers brushed against Clint's for the briefest of moments. A silent thank you. Clint gave her a small nod in return, and Loki saw it, saw the quiet understanding between them, saw the respect, the friendship, the unspoken bond in pain and survival. He did not resent it. He did not interrupt. because for once he understood. How it ended. Clint leaned back. She pulled herself out. It took time, a hell of a lot of patience, but in the end, she chose to live. For you, even when you weren't there anymore. Loki's throat tightened. The ranger turned to him, her gaze steady, unwavering, raw. I wasn't going to let your sacrifice be in vain, she said softly. I wasn't going to waste what you gave me. Loki couldn't speak. Didn't trust himself to. He just looked at her. Took in the depth of her words, the weight of what she had carried, the strength it had taken to keep going. And for the first time since he had returned, he understood just how much she had suffered. For him. Because of him. And yet she had still found her way back. And now, here she was, with him, whole, alive. And the gravity of it all nearly crushed him. No one rushed to fill the silence. There was no need. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The warmth of the meal lingered. And Loki, for the first time in a long time, felt something settle inside him. No pain, no emptiness. Not the rage that had once consumed him. Just something quiet, something real. Something he hadn't dared to hope for. Peace. The peace they earned. The night was quiet. The weight of battle, of loss, of pain, it had settled. Not forgotten, not erased, but laid to rest. Because they had earned this, every single one of them. And now, they let peace finally take hold. A god's quiet gratitude. Loki was not a man who thanked easily, but this was different. This was not a debt owed, not a bargain struck in shadows. This was something else. Something that could not be undone. So as Strange prepared to open a portal, as Clint stretched, getting ready to head out, Loki turned to him. Barton. Clint raised an eyebrow, still holding his half-empty mug of tea. Yeah? Loki hesitated. Then he nodded once. Thank you. Clint blinked, stared at him for a long moment, then smirked. Damn, I should have recorded that. You actually do know how to say it. Loki rolled his eyes, exhaling sharply. But there was no true irritation behind it, only understanding. And Clint, he just nodded, because he knew. Because no more words were needed. A watchful shield. Clint had made a call earlier, told Phil Coulson what happened, and Phil, being Phil, had done exactly what needed to be done. So now, out there in the quiet forest, shield agent patrolled the woods. Not intruding, not interfering, just watching, because Clint trusted them, because the ranger was family, because Loki was something else entirely. And S.H.I.E.L.D. was not in the business of making the same mistakes twice. A final goodbye. Strange looked at Loki and then at the ranger. He did not ask what came next, did not offer advice. He simply said, "Be well." And with that he opened a portal, stepping through with Clint. The golden light faded, and then, at last, it was just them. Loki let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair as he turned toward the fire. The warmth of the flames washed over him, their light flickering across the wooden walls, casting soft shadows across the room. The ranger settled beside him, her presence steady, unshaken, unmovable. He glanced at her, and for the first time in too long, he allowed himself to relax. She curled her legs beneath her, leaned back against the couch. Loki sat beside her, his gaze locked on the fire, his fingers loosely entwined with hers. No words, no rush. Just this. A quiet moment. A moment that belonged to them and no one else. For so long he had been fighting. For so long he had been searching. And now he was here, with her, and that was enough. For tonight, for this moment. And as the fire crackled softly, and the world outside faded into peaceful silence, as his grip on her hand tightened just slightly, Loki allowed himself to breathe. The quiet that remained. The fire burned low in the hearth, its warmth wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. The world outside was still. The weight of the night, of battles fought, of memories lost and found, lingered in the air. But here, in this cabin, in this moment of peace, there was no more war, no more pain, no more searching for something that had already been found. Loki leaned back against the couch, his body finally allowing itself to feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones. The ranger was beside him, her presence grounding, steady, whole. She had always been his anchor, even if he hadn't known it, even when he had forgotten her. She had been there. She had fought for him. She had brought him back. The ranger reached over, pulling the soft warm blanket from the side of the couch. She wrapped it over both of them, shifting slightly to rest against him, her head nestled in the curve of his shoulder. Loki turned his head, his gaze drifting down to her, watching as she closed her weary eyes, her breath even, steady, safe. He lifted a hand, fingers brushing through her hair, slow and absent-minded, a gesture of comfort, a gesture of home. She sighed softly, leaning further into him. And Loki? He let her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was no need. But just before sleep could finally take them, she murmured, a voice barely more than a whisper against the quiet night. "You're here." A statement, a truth. Loki's lips parted, and for a moment he did not know how to answer. And then his arms tightened around her, holding her closer, as if anchoring them both in this new reality, this life they had fought to reclaim. "I'm here." His voice was soft, raw, full of something deeper than words could ever say. She smiled against his chest. And then, with the fire burning low, the world fading into a quiet peace, and the weight of exhaustion finally pulling them down, they fell asleep, wrapped in each other, whole, together, and at long last, at peace. The morning after everything. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin, slipping through the curtains in golden threads, casting a warm glow over the wooden walls. The fire had burned low in the hearth, now just embers pulsing with faint heat. And on the couch, wrapped beneath the soft weight of the blanket, they lay together. Warm, safe, whole. Loki was awake. He had been for a while now, his body perfectly still, his mind quiet in a way that felt foreign yet welcome. His arms were wrapped around her, the ranger's head nestled against his chest, her breath slow and steady, her warmth pressed against him like she had always belonged there, like she had never left. His fingers brushed absent-mindedly through her hair, slow, careful, as if grounding himself in the truth of her presence. She was here. This was real. Not a cruel trick of fate. Not a dream that would slip through his fingers when he woke. Her, Tanya, his Tanya. She stirred slightly in his arms, her breath shifting against his chest, her fingers curling against the fabric of his tunic. Loki watched her, gaze soft, unreadable, steady. For so long he had been lost. For so long he had searched for something he could not name. And now? Now she was right here, in his arms, breathing softly against him. Her heartbeat steady, her presence grounding him in ways he had never known he needed. How had he ever lived without this? How had he ever let himself forget? A soft sigh escaped her lips, her eyelids fluttering slightly. She was waking. And Loki? He was not ready to let go. The ranger shifted, stretching slightly, the blanket slipping lower, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. Then her eyes slowly opened, sleepy, unfocused at first. Then they met his. Loki stilled, and for a moment neither of them moved. The world held quiet. His emerald gaze locked onto hers, watching as the moment of awareness flickered behind them. The realization of where she was, the realization of who she was with. And then a slow, sleepy smile curved at her lips. And Loki felt his heart stop, because gods help him, he had never seen anything so beautiful. Good morning. Her voice was soft, husky with sleep, warm in the morning sun. Loki swallowed, his throat oddly tight, his fingers still tangled in her hair. For a moment he didn't know how to answer, didn't know what to say, didn't know how to put into words what this meant, what she meant. So instead, his lips curved into something rare, simple, honest. Something that was not a smirk, nor a mask, nor a calculated expression. Just him. Good morning, Tanya, he murmured, his voice quieter, steadier, more real than it had been. And as the morning sun bathed them in golden light, as she leaned into his warmth just a little more, as Loki himself breathed her in, memorizing this, claimed this as something that was his. For the first time in a long, long time, the god of mischief had nothing to run from, nothing to chase, because he was exactly where he was meant to be, with her. And the universe? The universe let them be, for now, just for now. The call for morning coffee and hungry stomachs. The cabin was bathed in soft morning light, the warmth of dawn creeping through the windows, filling the space with the quiet hum of a new day. For a moment they just lay there, wrapped in warmth and the steady rhythm of their own heartbeats, in the comfort of simply existing together. Then, a soft, unmistakable rumble broke the silence. Loki's brow arched slightly, his gaze flicking to the ranger. She blinked, surprised, then groaned, pressing her face into his chest. Oh no. Another rumble, louder this time. Loki chuckled, amusement flickering in his eyes. Was that you? Maybe, came the muffled reply, voice thick with sleep. Loki smirked, about to make some clever remark. Then his own stomach grumbled, loud, demanding. The ranger froze. Then she laughed. Not just a small chuckle, not just a polite laugh, but a real, full-bodied, can't-hold-it-in kind of laughter. Loki sighed dramatically, tilting his head back against the couch. Treacherous body. Looks like we're both starving, she grinned, shifting slightly, stretching beneath the blanket. Come on, let's make some breakfast. Loki huffed, pretending to be put out by such mortal concerns. But the truth? He hadn't felt this light in ages. He hadn't laughed like this in far too long. And if breakfast was the next thing that held them in the small, peaceful moment, then he would take it. So he let her pull him up, rolling his eyes with exasperation. Fine, fine. if you expect me to cook, you may be gravely disappointed." The ranger smirked. "Then you're on coffee duty, trickster. Don't burn it." Loki placed a hand over his heart. "Darling, I'm insulted. When have I ever burned anything?" The ranger arched a brow. "Do you really want me to answer that?" Loki sighed, waving her off with a flick of his wrist. "On second thought, never mind. Just get to cooking, woman. I'll keep us supplied with caffeine." And so, with the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, with laughter still lingering in the air, with the scent of fresh coffee soon filling the cabin, they started their day. No battles, no cosmic horrors, no burdens hanging over their heads. Just breakfast, just each other. And for now, that was all they needed. A few days of peace. An unexpected visitor. The days that followed were quiet. No battles, no cosmic danger lurking in the shadows. Just Loki and the ranger existing in the soft rhythm of something new, something rare. Peace. They fell into an easy pattern, mornings spent wrapped in blankets on the couch, sipping coffee as the fire warmed the cabin. Afternoons spent walking through the woods, feeling the sun on their faces, breathing in the fresh air, feeling alive again. Evenings spent with cooking together, teasing and bickering over whose turn it was to make tea and who had to wash the dishes. And at night they held each other, not out of fear, not out of necessity, but because they simply could. And that was enough, until a knock at the door. An archer's arrival. Loki, lounging lazily on the couch with a book in his hands, narrowed his eyes at the sound. The ranger stretched out beside him, glanced up with mild curiosity. "Expecting someone?" Loki sighed, closing his book with a thud. "If I was, I would not have allowed them to knock." The ranger chuckled, shaking her head as she pushed herself up and strode towards the door. She pulled it open, and there stood Clint Barton, a broad grin on his face, 2 massive bags with fresh groceries in his arms. "Hope you 2 lovebirds didn't burn the place down yet," he smirked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Figured you might need some supplies. And let's be honest, you both probably forgot actual food exists." The ranger rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "You're impossible." "And yet you'd lost without me," Clint quipped, making his way to the kitchen as if he owned the place. "Now which of you makes better coffee? Because I need some before I even can think about cooking." Loki, who had yet to move from the couch, simply watched the entire scene unfold with an expression of pure suffering. "Does he ever stop talking?" he muttered under his breath. The ranger grinned, nudging Loki's foot as she passed. "Nope. Welcome to having friends, trickster." Loki sighed dramatically, but didn't argue, because for once, he didn't mind. And as Clint started pulling ingredients from the bags, grumbling about how neither of them knew how to properly stock a kitchen, the ranger laughed and grabbed a pan as the cabin filled with the warmth of something so ordinary, so human. Loki found himself smiling, because maybe this was what peace looked like. And for now, he could live with that. A second knock, and a new guest. Loki had barely time to recover from Clint's abrupt arrival before another knock. This time, he didn't even bother looking up from his book. "If that's another one of your shield friends come bursting in, I swear." The ranger laughed, shaking her head as she strode to the door. "You'll what, Loki? Gasp in mild irritation?" She pulled open the door, and there stood Natasha Romanoff. A small smirk on her lips, an eyebrow raised, a bag dangling casually from one hand. "I heard Barton was making one of his legendary game stews," she said smoothly, stepping inside as if she had always belonged here. And well, I just thought I'd also check in on you too. Her sharp gaze flickered between the Ranger and Loki, assessing, reading everything that hasn't been said. Loki exhaled slowly, setting his book aside, watching her with suspicion. Tell me, Romanov, do S.H.I.E.L.D. agents have some sort of telepathic link that alerts them whenever food is being prepared? Natasha smirked, holding up a bag. I brought wine. Clint from the kitchen immediately perked up. And beer for me? Natasha rolled her eyes. Obviously. Clint grinned. I knew there was a reason we kept you around. The Ranger stepped aside, motioning Natasha in. Come in before Loki slams the door in your face, out of sheer dramatics. Natasha chuckled, walking past Loki with a knowing glance. Relax, Loki, I didn't came to interrogate you. Just wanted to see if you two were adjusting. Loki leaned back, arms crossed, studying her. And what do you see? She tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking toward the Ranger for the briefest of moments, before settling back on him. I see two people who fought their way through hell and somehow managed to come back in one piece. Loki said nothing, because for once he had no clever retort. Natasha's gaze softened slightly before she turned to the kitchen. Now, where's that stew? Because if Clint's cooking, I might actually eat something edible for once. A night of simple things. The kitchen filled with the rich, savory scent of Clint's stew simmering over the fire. Natasha uncorked the wine, pouring a generous glass for herself and the Ranger, while Clint cracked open a beer and tossed another to Loki. Loki caught it effortlessly, raising an eyebrow. Do I look like I drink beer? Clint shrugged. What? Too unrefined for you, Your Highness? Loki sighed dramatically, but still took a sip. The Ranger curled up next to him, her fingers resting lightly on his knee, and he felt it. The comfort, the warmth, the normalcy of it all. For so long his life had been chaos, war, betrayal, and survival. But this was different. This was peace, and maybe, just maybe, he could get used to it. Even if it meant tolerating S.H.I.E.L.D. agents in his home. For now. An evening of laughter, stew, and something like normalcy. For the first time in what felt like forever, Loki allowed himself to relax. Truly relax. Not with one eye on the shadows. Not with the weight of 1,000 battles hanging over him. Not with the suffocating emptiness of loss clawing at his chest. Just here. Now. The fire crackling in the hearth and the rich scent of Clint's stew filling the air. The Ranger sat beside him, close enough that he would feel her presence without needing to reach for it. He didn't need to. She was here, and that was enough. A feast worthy of legends. All right, prepare to be amazed, Clint declared, dramatically setting bowls of steaming hot stew in front of them. Natasha smirked. If you're hyping this up too much, it better be good. Good? Clint scoffed, placing a hand over his heart. This, my friends, is legendary. Loki arched an eyebrow. You're oddly passionate about this, Barton. Clint pointed at him with a wooden spoon. Eat first, judge later. Loki exhaled through his nose, but took a slow, deliberate spoonful. And, by the Norns, it was perfect. The meat was tender, melting on the tongue, with a richness that spoke of hours of slow cooking, of carefully chosen herbs and deep flavors. The broth was hearty and warm, filling him from inside out. It was comforting. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Loki felt something like he had not felt in a long time. At home. The Ranger hummed in appreciation. All right, I admit it. This is amazing. Natasha nodded another bite. Fine, Barton. You win this round. Clint grinned. Told ya. Now, someone pass me another beer before I start crying from validation. As they ate, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Natasha and Clint bantered back and forth, sharing stories from old missions, ridiculous moments that sounded too absurd to be true. Natasha smirking as she recounted the time she had made an undercover drop disguised as a wedding guest, only for Clint to show up in a borrowed tuxedo and crash the event entirely. I was being tactical, Clint protested. You were taking too long. You got drunk on champagne and tried to start a conga line, Natasha shot back. The Ranger laughed. I'm sorry, what? It was a strategic distraction, Clint insisted. And for the record, it worked. Loki, who had been watching the exchange with a quiet amusement, shook his head. And I was accused of being dramatic. Clint gestured at him. See? Even Loki gets it. Loki simply took another sip of wine, a smirk tugging at his lips, because this was not something he had ever thought he would experience. A table filled with laughter, warmth, and easy conversation. A night spent not plotting, or fighting, or surviving, but simply existing. And that, he realized with a quiet sort of shock, he liked it. By the time the meal was finished, the fire had burned low, glowing embers pulsing softly in the hearth. Clint leaned back in the chair, stretching. All right, I've done myself. I'll accept any culinary awards whenever you're ready. We'll engrave it on your tombstone, Natasha mused, sipping her wine. The Ranger chuckled, shaking her head. It was really incredible, Clint. Loki, who had been absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the rim of his glass, tilted his head. I suppose I will admit it was quite satisfactory. Satisfactory. Legendary, Loki amended smoothly, eyes glinting with mischief. Clint grinned, clearly pleased. Damn right it was. The conversation drifted on, slow and easy, weaving through memories, jokes, quiet stories shared between people who had seen too much, but still found ways to smile. And Loki? Loki listened. Loki laughed. Loki felt something settle in his chest. Because tonight there were no gods, no soldiers, no battles, no cosmic forces waiting to take something away. Just them, just this. Loki was at peace, and it was perfect. A simple question, a heavy answer. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between laughter and fading conversation. The night had settled comfortably around them, wrapping them in something gentle. Then, Clint's voice, quiet, steady, not teasing, not sarcastic, just honest. How are you? A simple question, but not really, because it held so much more. The Ranger looked at him first, and she saw it. The way his blue eyes softened with something deeper than casual concern. The way he wasn't just asking to ask. He meant it. And not just for her. For Loki. For both of them. Loki felt it too. His jaw tensed slightly, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wineglass, before he set it down carefully. For a moment, neither of them answered, because how could they? After everything, after loss and emptiness and sacrifice, after losing themselves and finding their way back to each other again. How were they? They didn't know. The Ranger was the first to speak. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself, feeling Loki's presence beside her, his warmth, his existence. She turned to Clint, and she told the truth. I'm healing. Not fine, not perfect, not unscathed, just healing, and that was enough. Loki's gaze flickered towards her, something undecipherable passing behind his eyes. Then he spoke too, his voice lower, but just as raw. I am here. It was the most honest thing he could say, because that was all that matters. Not the scars, not the memories of what had been lost and regained. Just this. He was here. Clint held their gazes for a long moment. Then he nodded. A simple gesture, a quiet acceptance. Because he understood. Because he'd been there too. And Natasha, watching silently, took a sip of her wine and muttered, "Healing is good." Loki glanced at her, surprised by the softness in her voice, by the understanding in her expression, but he didn't question it. Didn't need to. Because for once, there were no more walls between them. No more games, just a quiet, simple truth. They were alive. They were here. And that was everything. The conversation shifted back to lighter things. The fire burned low. The night stretched on, filled with soft laughter, warmth, and the presence of those who mattered. Clint didn't push further. Natasha didn't pry. Because they didn't need to. They had their answers. And for tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow would come. The future would unfold. But for now, they were healing. A night worth holding on to. The fire had burned low, its glow casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the forest was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of the night, the crisp air whispering through the trees. Inside? Inside there was warmth. Inside there was something rare, something worth holding on to, and none of them were quite ready for it to end. "All right, I'm moving," Clint announced, stretching his legs out and leaning back against a chair. "Too much stew, too much wine. I live here now." Natasha rolled her eyes. "You're hopeless." "I'm practical," he shot back. "And you know what? The fire looks better than the table. I vote we migrate." The ranger chuckled. "You're just looking for an excuse to get more comfortable." "Damn right I am." Loki exhaled sharply, shaking his head, but when the ranger nudged him gently, he sighed in mock defeat. "Fine, but if you expect me to carry you there, Barton, you'll be sorely disappointed." Clint smirked. "Oh, I'd expect nothing less from you, Your Highness." With that, they shifted, moving from the dining table to the plush rugs and cushions scattered near the hearth, sinking into a familiar warmth of the fire. Loki settled against the couch, the ranger curling up beside him, her warmth pressing into his side. Natasha leaned against Clint, the two of them huddled comfortably, their friendship and unspoken, unwavering force. No battles, no strategy, no need for words, just quiet companionship. Loki wasn't sure when he had last experienced this, not the silence of solitude, not the restlessness of waiting, but something else entirely. Something he had never realized he craved, something whole. His fingers traced absent-mindedly over the ranger's hand, not to comfort her, but to ground himself. She let him, didn't pull away, didn't say anything, because she understood. Because she always understood. Clint let out a deep sigh. Man, if every night could be like this, I would actually retire. Natasha smirked. You retire? That's cute. Hey, a guy can dream. The ranger chuckled, tilting her head against Loki's shoulder. And what would you even do with yourself, Barton? Herd sheep, grow tomatoes, become a professional stew chef. Natasha laughed. You'd last a week before you got bored. Maybe two, he admitted. But still, I'd try. Loki watched them, their easy conversation, their quiet teasing, and something settled inside him. For so long he had believed that connection was a fleeting thing, something that could only end in betrayal. But this was different. This was real. The fire burned lower, the warmth sinking into their bones, lulling them into a peace none of them had dared hope for. There was no rush to leave, no urgency to part ways. The world outside could wait. For now. For tonight. They were just people. People who had lost too much, fought too hard, and somehow still found each other. And that was everything. So they stayed, huddled by the fire, wrapped in warmth and quiet laughter. Loki held the ranger close. Natasha leaned against Clint, eyes half-lidded, her guard, for once, lowered. And as the embers glowed softly in the hearth, as the night stretched out in perfect peace, the universe let them rest. Just a little longer, because they deserved it. The quiet didn't last forever. It never did. The sound of a Quinjet landing cut through the stillness of the night, its engines a low, steady hum as it descended into the clearing near the cabin. Clint let out an exaggerated sigh, stretching his arms behind his head. "Guess that's our ride." Natasha exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders before pushing herself upright. "And I was actually enjoying myself." Clint groaned. Yeah, same here. Damn shield. Always ruined perfectly good moments." Loki still settled against the couch, with the ranger beside him, arched an eyebrow. "It's almost as if you work for them." "Almost," Clint muttered, running a hand through his hair. Then a knock at the door. Natasha stood, casting a quick glance toward the ranger. The ranger met her gaze, then nodded. Ned opened the door. And there, standing in the cold night air, was Phil Coulson, a man who had, once upon a time, died at Loki's hand. Coulson's expression was calm, unreadable, steady as ever. His sharp gaze flickered briefly to Loki, but he made no comment. Then he looked at the ranger, offering a small professional nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Loki let out a scoff. "You are." Coulson's lips twitched slightly. "Good to know some things never change." As Coulson entered the cabin, the presence felt like the weight of reality settling over them. Not dangerous, not threatening, just a reminder that the world outside was still moving, and their peace could not last forever. Coulson took a moment to glance around. The empty plates from dinner still on the table, the warmth of the fire still crackling in the hearth. The ranger and Loki still huddled together on the couch. His gaze lingered on them for just a second longer before he turned to Clint and Natasha. "You two ready?" Natasha nodded, already reaching for her jacket. "I assume this isn't just a social call?" "Unfortunately, no," Coulson replied. "Director Fury wants an update on some developments." Clint groaned, pushing himself up. Yeah, I'm coming." Then Coulson turned his attention back to Loki and the ranger, and this time his expression shifted. Something more serious, more measured. "I know you two have been through a lot," he said carefully, "and I wasn't sent here to pull you into anything, but," he hesitated, "there are things happening, things Fury wants eyes on. I don't expect either of you to care, but I figured you should at least know." Loki tilted his head, gaze sharp. "Why?" Coulson held his stare. "Because whatever is coming, you two might be the only ones to see it for what it really is." The choice that wasn't urgent. Yet. The words hung in the air for a moment. Not a demand, not an order. Just a quiet offering, a warning. Loki's fingers tightened around the ranger's hand. Almost imperceptible. She felt it, understood it. But she also saw something else in Coulson's eyes, something unspoken. Something bigger than the bureaucracy of S.H.I.E.L.D., something real. Natasha sighed, glancing back at them. No one's expecting an answer now. Just think about it. Clint, ever casual, threw them both a lazy salute before following her out the door. Coulson hesitated for just a second longer, then gave the ranger a small nod. "Take care of yourselves." Then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and the quiet returned. But it was different now, because the world outside, it was moving again. And sooner or later, they would have to move with it. For now, the fire still burns. Loki let out a slow breath, his free hand rubbing over his face, exhaustion creeping in again. The ranger didn't move, didn't speak, just stayed beside him. Loki finally muttered, "They never truly leave us alone, do they?" The ranger smiled faintly, leaning back against him. "No, but we still have tonight." He exhaled slowly. Then he let it go, because she was right. The world would come for them eventually, but not yet. For now, the fire still burned. And so they stayed, together, and the universe, for just a little longer, let them be.